I've got a pulse." The words came out of Chief Vasquez like something torn loose. He was on his knees in 3 feet of snow, gloves stripped off with his teeth, fingers pressed to the throat of a woman who should have been dead 4 hours ago. -71 degrees. A bullet wound above her collarbone, packed with gauze she'd taped there herself, one-handed, in the dark. "That's not possible," Bannerman said. "Check her yourself." They'd been sent to recover a body. What they found was a 27-year-old woman who'd built a shelter out of snow and spruce branches while bleeding, then counted backward from 100 in sevens to keep herself awake until morning. She hadn't survived by luck. She'd survived because a grandmother nobody in the Navy would name out loud had spent an entire childhood teaching her exactly how, and had never once told her why. The wind came off the ridge at 11 knots, gusting to 15, and Harlow Reyes could feel the difference in her teeth before the instruments ever confirmed it. She was small for the work she did, 5'3" in boots, built more like a gymnast than the broad-shouldered image most people carried in their heads when they pictured a marksman. And she'd learned a long time ago to let that surprise work in her favor instead of against her. People underestimated a woman who barely cleared their shoulder, right up until she proved them wrong. She stood at the tree line with 6 strangers behind her, all of them paying $400 for a weekend of what her flyer called wilderness endurance and precision. Most came for the Instagram photo. A few came because they were tired of being afraid of the cold, of the woods, of themselves. Harlow never asked which. She just taught. "Watch the branches," she said, "not the flag. Flags lie." A woman named Denise raised a gloved hand. "The flag's not moving at all." "Exactly." Harlow didn't turn around. She was watching a stand of black spruce 200 yards downslope, watching the top third of the canopy bend while the trunk beneath stayed still. That's a shear layer. Wind's doing something different up top than it's doing down here. You shoot without knowing that, you miss. You hike without knowing that, you get caught in weather you didn't see coming. A younger man near the back, ex-military by the way he stood even when nobody asked him to, cleared his throat. "How'd you learn to read it that fast? Seems like it'd take years." It did. Harlow didn't elaborate, and something in her tone closed the subject without her needing to say so directly. "Watch the tree line." "Not me." Harlow crouched, sighted an imaginary line between 2 boulders. Didn't need a rifle to teach the reading of wind. Not for this group, but her hands moved anyway, out of habit. Out of 20 years of a habit that started before she could ride a bike without training wheels. A second student, older, quieter than the rest, watched Harlow's hands with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing something more than technique. "You make it look like breathing," the woman said. "It is breathing, eventually." Harlow straightened, met the woman's eyes briefly. "Everything starts as a decision. Give it enough years, it stops being a decision and just becomes who you are." Because that was the thing nobody in this class understood. They thought she was a survival instructor who happened to be good with a scope. She was not that. She had been built piece by piece by a woman who never once explained why a 9-year-old needed to know the difference between a headwind and a crosswind at 400 yards. Her grandmother never explained anything. She just handed Harlow a rifle that weighed almost as much as she did and said again. The class finished at 4. Harlow watched the last SUV pull out of the gravel lot, watched the dust settle over ruts that would freeze solid by morning, and she let herself exhale the way she never let herself exhale in front of paying customers. Alone now. Just her and 11,000 acres of Alaska going purple at the edges as the sun quit early, the way it always did this far north, this late in the year. She ran the perimeter check anyway. Nobody paid her to do it. Nobody knew she did it. Not even the handful of locals who considered themselves close friends. Because the routine belonged to a version of herself she'd never once explained out loud to anyone still living. Gear shed locked checked. Propane tanks secured checked. Tree line to the north, ganned slow, left to right. The way her grandmother had taught her before Harlow was tall enough to see over the porch rail without a step stool. Checked. Nothing. Just wind and the particular hush of a forest deciding whether or not to snow. She caught herself doing it and made herself stop. The way she always made herself stop, standing very still in the middle of her own gravel lot until the tightness in her shoulders eased back down to something normal. Because this was the thing nobody who signed up for her weekend courses would ever understand about her. They thought vigilance was a skill she taught. They had no idea it was also a leash she wore, every single day whether she wanted to or not, because that was what Eleanor had left her, along with the rifle and the reading of wind and the particular, patient cruelty of loving someone enough to prepare them for a war she never once named. A body that flinched first and asked questions later. A mind that cataloged exits in every room she ever walked into, automatically, before she'd even decided to sit down. Most days it didn't cost her anything. Most days it just made her good at her job. Today, for reasons she couldn't yet name, it felt like something closer to a warning. Her phone buzzed in the truck's cup holder. A number she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. Almost. She answered. Harlow Reyes? Depends who's asking. Desmond Cray. I used to work with your grandmother's old handlers. Long time ago. Before your time, probably. Harlow's hand tightened on the wheel. Not because she knew the name. Because she'd spent her whole life waiting for a call that started exactly like this one. And some buried animal part of her recognized the shape of it before her brain caught up. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think you've read enough of Eleanor's old notebooks to know exactly what I'm talking about. Silence. The kind that has weight. Who gave you my number? Does it matter? I need 40 minutes. I'm parked outside your cabin. I've been here since 2. Harlow looked in her rearview mirror like the man might already be standing behind her. He wasn't. Of course he wasn't. But the fear didn't care about logic. Fear rarely does. 40 minutes, she said. Then you leave. He was sitting on the porch steps when she pulled in. A man somewhere north of 50, with a government-issue posture even in civilian clothes. The kind of stillness that only comes from years of being trained to hold it. He stood when her headlights hit him. Didn't approach. Waited for her to come to him, which told her something about how careful he intended to be. The cold hadn't touched him at all, she noticed, standing there in nothing heavier than a field jacket, while her own breath fogged thick in front of her face. Either he didn't feel it the way normal people did, or he'd trained himself, a long time ago, never to let it show. You look like her, he said, around the eyes. You've got 39 minutes left, he almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. Inside he didn't sit until she told him to. Didn't touch anything. Laid a manila folder on her kitchen table like it might detonate. A survey team went dark 9 days ago, he said. 6 people. Contracted through a private research outfit doing cold weather infrastructure testing up in the Wrangles. Last known position. A facility about 40 miles from a ridge system your grandmother used to hike. A lot. Lots of people hike the Wrangles. Not to that ridge. Not since 1978. The number landed in the room like a dropped glass. Harlow made herself keep her expression flat, the way Eleanor had taught her to keep it flat across 100 negotiations that mattered far less than this one. Who are the 6? Harlow asked, forcing her voice into something steadier than she felt. Names. Backgrounds. Civilian contractors. Engineers, mostly. 1 medic. Desmond didn't reach for the folder. Didn't need to. The details clearly memorized long before he ever knocked on her door. No military affiliation officially. No distress signal before they went dark. One day they were checking in on schedule. The next day, nothing. Search teams found their base camp untouched. Tents still standing. That's not a storm story. No, he agreed. It isn't. Who sent the search teams? The company that contracted them. A pause, brief, almost too brief to notice. Corvide Dynamics. Harlow didn't answer right away. Because there was a box in her closet. Because inside that box was a leather notebook with a busted spine and a coordinate written in the back cover in her grandmother's slanted, furious handwriting. No explanation. Just numbers. Underlined 3 times. Because she had memorized those numbers at 14 without knowing why. The way you memorize a phone number you're too scared to call. Say the coordinates, she said. He did. They matched. Of course they matched. She'd known they would before he finished speaking. And the knowing didn't make it easier. It made it worse. It made her stomach drop, the way it dropped the first time she took a shot she wasn't sure she could make and made it anyway. I'm not interested, she said, and heard how unconvincing it sounded even to herself. 6 people are missing in country that kills unprepared hikers in under 6 hours this time of year. We need someone who can move through that terrain the way your grandmother could. You're the only person alive who fits that description. Find someone else." "There isn't anyone else." He said it flat, not pleading. "Just fact. That's not a sales pitch, Ms. Reyes. That's the actual situation." "How do you even know about my grandmother?" "Really, no, not rumors." Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and careful. "I worked adjacent to programs that crossed paths with her a long time ago. I never met her personally. I only know what got passed down through people who did." He held her gaze steadily. "That's the truth, as much of it as I have." Harlow studied him a moment longer, weighing the answer, unable to decide whether it satisfied her or simply gave her one more thing to distrust. She looked at the folder. Didn't open it yet. Some part of her understood that opening it was the same as agreeing, and she wasn't ready to agree. Not out loud, not yet. "Leave the folder," she said. "You have your 40 minutes. They're over." He left without another word. Good instincts, she thought, or good training. Sometimes those were the same thing. She stood at the window a long time after his taillights disappeared down the gravel drive, watching the dark settle in fully now, watching her own reflection layer itself over the black glass, until she couldn't tell anymore which face was hers and which was just the window doing what windows did at night. 6 people. A ridge her grandmother had spent 40 years refusing to speak of. A coordinate memorized at 14 and never once explained. She poured a glass of water she didn't drink, sat down at the table, stood back up, because there was a version of tonight where she simply didn't open the folder at all, where she called Desmond Cray in the morning, told him to find someone else, and went back to teaching strangers how to read wind through branches, and never thought about that ridge again for the rest of her life. Except that version of tonight had never once, not for a single second, felt like a real option. Not since he said the coordinates out loud. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, with the folder closed in front of her, and her grandmother's notebook open beside it, and she read the same page 4 times without absorbing a word of it, because her mind kept snagging on the coordinates, kept circling back the way a tongue circles back to a sore tooth. At some point past midnight, her thumb hovered over her mother's contact in her phone, unbidden, an old habit that had never quite died no matter how many years of silence sat between them. She didn't call, a silence that had lasted 3 years now, born from a fight neither of them had ever properly untangled. Something Harlow had said that was cutting and true and utterly unfair in the same breath. Something about Marguerite always keeping her at arm's length, always flinching from anything that looked too much like closeness. And Marguerite had gone quiet in that particular way she always went quiet, the way that meant the conversation was over, whether Harlow wanted it to be or not. Harlow had spent 3 years telling herself the distance was her mother's doing, sitting here now, with a folder full of secrets that traced directly back to a woman neither of them had ever fully understood. Some small, unwelcome part of her wondered, for the first time, whether that story had always been more complicated than she'd let herself admit. She put the phone down. Not tonight, maybe not for a long time yet, which was insane, which made no sense. Because she hadn't thought about that ridge in years. Except she had. Except she thought about it every single winter. When the light went the particular gray it went right before the first big snow. The exact gray her grandmother used to stop and stare at through the kitchen window, like she was watching something only she could see. Harlow had asked her once, "What are you looking at, Grandma?" Eleanor hadn't answered, just closed the blinds. Now Harlow sat in that same kitchen, in that same gray light, 40 years later, and understood for the first time that her grandmother hadn't been looking at the weather. She'd been looking north, toward that ridge, like it was watching her back. Harlow closed her eyes and let herself go back just for a moment to a version of that kitchen with more light in it. She was 9 years old, cold enough outside that her breath fogged even through the mesh of her hunting cap, and Eleanor stood behind her on a stretch of frozen field a half-mile from the cabin, hands folded, watching, saying nothing at all while Harlow tried, for the 4th time that morning, to hold a rifle nearly as long as she was tall, steady enough to hit a paper plate nailed to a fence post 60 yards out. "You're breathing wrong," Eleanor said. "I'm breathing fine. You're breathing like it's a race." "It isn't a race." Eleanor crouched beside her, adjusted the angle of Harlow's elbow with 2 fingers, light as a whisper, and hold. "Let it out slow. And somewhere in that slow part, right before your lungs go empty, That's where you live. That's where the shot happens. Not before. Not after. That's weird. Most true things are. A flicker of something almost like a smile. Try again. Harlow tried again, missed by a foot. Eleanor didn't sigh, didn't wince, didn't do any of the things Harlow half expected an adult to do watching a 9-year-old fail at something dangerous. She just said again, the same flat, patient words she'd say 10,000 more times over the years that followed. And Harlow, even at 9, understood somehow that the word wasn't criticism. It was faith. Eleanor Ashworth did not waste breath correcting people she didn't believe could eventually get it right. By the 40th try, the plate rang. Harlow remembered the sound more clearly than she remembered almost anything else from that entire winter, a small, bright clang traveling all the way across the frozen field and back again, and she remembered turning around, breathless, grinning, expecting praise. Eleanor hadn't smiled. She'd nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and said, "Now do it when you're tired. Now do it when you're scared." A shot you can only make when everything's easy isn't a skill. It's luck wearing a skill's clothes. Harlow hadn't understood, not then, why her grandmother pushed so hard, why every lesson came wrapped in a seriousness that felt, some days, like more weight than a child should have to carry. She understood it now, sitting in a dark kitchen decades later with a stranger's folder open on the table in front of her. Eleanor hadn't been teaching her to shoot. She'd been teaching her to survive a world Eleanor herself had never fully escaped. Eleanor Ashworth had been 32 years old in the winter of 1978, and she had already been the best shot in 3 counties by the time anyone in a government sedan bothered to notice. They came to her not with threats. That would have been easier to refuse. They came with flattery, with talk of service, with a man in a wool coat who called her a national asset over coffee she hadn't asked him to pour. The program didn't have a clean name. It never did. The ones that mattered least to explain and most to hide. Officially, it studied human performance in extreme cold. Unofficially, Eleanor understood within 3 weeks. It studied how much a human body could be pushed past its limits before something broke that didn't heal. She was good. She was young, or young enough. She had nothing to lose, they told her, meaning no husband, no family name influential enough to make her disappearance costly, no one whose grief would cost them anything. What she did have, though nobody in that room ever thought to ask, was a young daughter waiting for her back home, a fact Eleanor never once volunteered to the men measuring her value in a column of acceptable risk. They were wrong about the nothing. She had herself. And after the 3rd week, watching what they did to a man named Corwin, who came back from a 48-hour exposure trial with hands that shook for the rest of his life, she decided herself was enough of a reason to walk away. She refused the 4th trial. They didn't like that. There was a night. She never wrote down everything about that night, not even in the notebook, not even in the pages. Harlow had spent years trying to piece together like a puzzle, missing half its edges. But she wrote enough to know there had been a man, young then, eager then, standing in the corner of a briefing room saying nothing while Eleanor was told, calmly, without raising a voice, exactly what would happen to her career, her reputation, her ability to ever work in this field again if she kept saying no. She said no anyway. She disappeared into Alaska 2 years later and never spoke of it again. Not to her daughter, not to anyone, until the notebook, which she filled slowly over decades, which she never once mentioned existed, which Harlow found by accident in a box marked winter coats 3 weeks after the funeral. The entries after 1978 grew sparser, spaced years apart instead of weeks, as though Eleanor had rationed her own honesty the way some people rationed money. One entry, written not long after they settled into the cabin in Alaska, simply read, "Marguerite asked today why we never go north. I told her the roads were bad that direction. She's young enough to believe me. I don't know how much longer that will work, and I don't know what I'll tell her when it stops." Another, years later still, they called again. Different names this time, different letterhead, same questions underneath all of it. I said no the way I always say no. Some refusals you only have to make once. This one, I think, I'll be making for the rest of my life. Harlow had read that line so many times the ache of it had gone almost numb. The particular numbness that comes from grief worn smooth with handling. Tonight, though, it cut fresh. Because tonight, she finally understood the price her grandmother had paid to keep saying that same small, enormous word for 4 decades running. The young man in the corner of that briefing room had a name. Eleanor wrote it exactly once on the last page, like she couldn't bring herself to write it twice. Silas Marrow. Harlow read that name so many times over the years that it had stopped feeling like words. It felt like a splinter, something under the skin that never fully worked its way out. She hadn't known until Desmond Cray's folder sat unopened on her table that Silas Marrow was still alive, still active, still. According to the header on page 1 of that folder, chairman and majority owner of a private defense contractor called Corvide Dynamics. The same Corvide Dynamics that owned the research facility 40 miles from her grandmother's ridge. The same Corvide Dynamics whose missing survey team Desmond Cray wanted her to find. Harlow closed the notebook, opened the folder. She read until the sun came up, and by the time it did, she wasn't the same woman who'd gone to bed the night before, not fully, because now she understood something that made refusal impossible. Before she called anyone, she spent an hour at her own kitchen table, doing what her grandmother never had the tools to do. She searched. Corvide Dynamics turned out to be almost aggressively unremarkable online, a handful of press releases about cold weather equipment contracts, a sparse leadership page listing a chairman's name without a photograph, an address that traced back to a Delaware holding company, 3 layers removed from anything resembling a physical office. The kind of company built, Harlow understood immediately, specifically to be boring, specifically to discourage anyone from looking twice. She looked twice anyway. Buried 4 pages deep in a search result she almost didn't bother clicking, she found a decades-old newspaper clipping, scanned and uploaded by some small-town historical society, about a cold weather research initiative that had operated briefly in the same mountain range back in the late 1970s before quietly folding. No scandal mentioned. No names beyond a single quoted program administrator, praising the initiative's contribution to military preparedness in language so carefully bland it read like it had been written by committee. The administrator's name wasn't given in the clipping, just a title. Program Director. Harlow stared at the grainy black and white photograph accompanying the article for a long time. A young man in a dark coat standing at the edge of a group photo, half turned away from the camera, face mostly lost to shadow and poor print quality. She couldn't confirm it was him. Not from this, but something in the posture, the stillness of a man clearly uncomfortable being photographed at all, made the back of her neck prickle, in a way she'd learned a long time ago never to ignore. This was never going to be a stranger's emergency she could politely decline. This was a door her grandmother had spent 40 years standing in front of, back-braced, refusing to let it open. And now it was open anyway. Whether Harlow walked through it or not, she called Bridger Callahan first, because Bridger picked up on the second ring no matter the hour, a habit left over from years of night operations where a missed call meant someone bled out waiting. Reyes, it's 5 in the morning, I need you. A pause, not hesitation, recalibration. That was how Bridger's mind worked, she'd always thought. Less like a switch and more like a compass finding north. Tell me where, not on the phone, copy. I'm 2 hours out. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was very Bridger. And Harlow allowed herself 30 seconds of something close to gratitude before she called Marisol Andreyka, who answered already mid-sentence. Already awake, already somehow, halfway prepared for exactly this kind of call. You sound like you're about to ruin my week, Marisol said. Probably. Good. My week was boring anyway. A pause and then quieter, more serious. This about the notebook. The one you never let either of us actually read. Harlow closed her eyes. Yeah. Then I'm already packing. Bridger arrived first, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a face that had learned stillness the hard way, in places Harlow had heard about only in fragments over years of careful trust building. He'd been a combat engineer once, the kind who cleared paths through places that didn't want to be walked through, and he still moved like a man perpetually checking the ground in front of him for something that might not want to be stepped on. He hugged Harlow briefly at the door, hard and quick, the kind of hug that said more than either of them would ever say out loud. You look like hell, he said. You look like you slept in a truck. I did sleep in a truck. He set his bag down inside the door without being asked, already scanning the kitchen, already cataloging exits the same automatic way Harlow did. a habit they shared without ever once discussing where either of them had picked it up. "Talk to me." Marisol came an hour later, younger than Bridger by a decade, sharp-eyed, quiet in a way that made people underestimate her right up until she said something that cut straight through whatever they'd assumed. She'd run communications for a private security contractor in 3 different countries before she quit. Tired, she'd told Harlow once, of building networks for people whose motives she'd stopped trusting somewhere around year 2. She came through the door already talking, already half amused at her own inconvenience, dropping a duffel bag by the coat rack like she'd done it 100 times before, which, Harlow supposed, she basically had. "This better be good," Marisol said. "I had a date tonight." "You always have a date." "I have excellent taste in distraction." She dropped into a kitchen chair, kicked her boots up onto the seat beside her, and finally really looked, at Harlow's face. Whatever she saw there wiped the humor clean off her own. "Okay, what happened?" Harlow laid the folder open on the table, laid her grandmother's notebook beside it. "This isn't a rescue," she said. "Not only a rescue. I think it's a cover story. I think there's something at that facility somebody wants found before we do, or wants hidden before anyone official gets there first." Bridger studied the coordinates, went very still. "This is the ridge. You know it?" "I know the name in your grandmother's notebook." He looked up. "You told me that name once. 3 years ago. Middle of the night. You were 3 drinks past sober and you never brought it up again, I remember. Marrow's company owns this facility." "Yes." Marisol leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes narrow. "So we're not just finding 6 missing contractors. No, we're finding out what your grandmother refused to let them finish." Harlow didn't answer that directly. Couldn't really, because the honest answer lived somewhere past words, somewhere in the part of her chest that had ached, dull and persistent, since the moment Desmond Cray said the coordinates out loud. "I need to know what happened to those 6 people," she said instead. "And I need to know if it's connected. That's it. That's the whole mission. We go in, we find them, we find out, we come home." Nobody in the room believed it would be that simple. Nobody said so. They spent the next 2 days preparing the way people prepare for country that does not forgive mistakes. Bridger handled the rifles personally. 3 of them, each broken down on a blanket in Harlow's garage, each reassembled with the kind of patience that looked, from a distance, like meditation. He recalibrated the scopes for extreme cold, adjusted for the way frigid air thickens and bends a bullet's path differently than warm air ever would, the way barrels contract in temperatures low enough to make metal behave like something closer to glass. He checked her Barrett twice. Then a 3rd time, wordless, because that was how Bridger said, "I care about you coming back." Marisol handled communications, satellite units rated for conditions that would kill a phone in under 10 minutes, backup batteries wrapped in thermal sleeves, frequencies logged and cross-checked against known dead zones in that section of the range. "You're going to want a 4th backup," Marisol said, mid-afternoon on the first day, holding up a battery pack and turning it over like she didn't quite trust it. "That cold's going to eat through gear twice as fast as the manual promises. Manuals always lie about cold. You sound like you've been burned by a manual before." "I've been burned by several manuals. It's a whole personal history." Marisol set the pack down, glanced up, something more serious flickering behind the joke. "You really think Corvide's still operating whatever your grandmother walked away from?" "I think somebody is. And if we find proof, then it stops being buried." Harlow's voice came out harder than she intended, and she didn't soften it. "That's the whole point, Marisol. Whatever this costs, it stops being buried." Marisol studied her for a moment, then nodded once, the particular nod of someone deciding a thing was settled and didn't need revisiting. "Okay, then let's make sure we come back to finish the job properly." Harlow handled the part nobody else could. She sat with the notebook every night after the gear was packed, reading her grandmother's handwriting until the shapes of the letters stopped being letters and started being a voice. A warning, maybe. Or an apology. She wasn't sure which, and some nights she wasn't sure there was a difference. Late on the first night of preparation, unable to sleep, Harlow found herself standing in front of the closet where the box had lived for years, running her fingers along its cardboard edge without opening it again. Inside, beneath the notebook's usual resting place, sat a second item she rarely let herself look at. A photograph, faded at the corners, of Eleanor at maybe 30, rifle slung easy across one shoulder, standing on a ridge that Harlow now recognized instantly, squinting into a sun that had long since set on whatever life her grandmother might have had if a man in a wool coat had never once knocked on her door. Harlow studied the photograph a long time, tried to find, in that young, unguarded face, some hint of the woman who would spend the next 5 decades teaching her granddaughter to survive a threat she never named. She found only a woman who looked, in that single frozen moment, entirely, uncomplicatedly happy, which made everything that came after so much harder to carry. Harlow put the photograph back exactly where she found it, closed the box, and went to check her gear one more time, because checking gear was a thing her hands knew how to do, even when her mind refused to cooperate. On the second night, close to midnight, Bridger found her still at the kitchen table. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know. That's not the same as wanting to hear you say it out loud." She looked up at him. "If I don't go, nobody does, and whatever's up there stays buried. Again, like it's been buried for 40 years. Her voice caught, just slightly, on the word buried. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Bridger. I need you to understand that. I'm doing it because somebody has to finally ask the question my grandmother spent her whole life running from instead of asking." He nodded slowly, didn't push further. That was the thing about Bridger. The thing that made him worth trusting with a rifle at your back in weather that killed people who trusted less carefully. He knew which questions to leave alone. The morning before they flew out, Harlow drove the 20 minutes to the small cemetery outside town where Eleanor was buried, under a plain granite marker that gave away nothing about the life underneath it. No rank, no unit, just a name, 2 dates, and a line Eleanor had chosen herself, years before she died, that Harlow had never once fully understood until this exact week. She kept her own counsel. Harlow crouched in front of the stone, brushed a thin layer of new snow off its top edge, and sat with her grandmother's name for a long time without saying anything at all. "I read the notebook," she finally said. "All of it. I know what you did, what you refused." Her breath fogged in the cold morning air. "I'm going up there, Grandma. I don't know yet if that's what you'd want or the last thing you'd want, but I can't leave it buried anymore. I don't think I ever really could." The wind moved through the bare branches overhead, and Harlow told herself it was only wind, the same way she'd tell herself 100 more times over the coming days, that the things she felt on that mountain were only weather, only exhaustion, only her own mind reaching for comfort in a place that offered none. She stood, pressed 2 fingers briefly to the top of the stone, and walked back to the truck without looking back, because looking back had never once, in her whole life, made leaving any easier. They flew out at dawn on the 3rd day, a chartered helicopter with a pilot named Otis who'd flown supply runs into worse weather than this for 30 years and had the leathery, unbothered face to prove it. Otis didn't ask questions on the tarmac, didn't ask why 3 passengers loaded rifle cases alongside standard survival gear, didn't ask why the woman up front kept glancing at a folded coordinate sheet like it might change if she looked away too long. He'd flown enough charters into enough remote country to know which questions paid and which ones didn't. "You Eleanor's granddaughter?" he asked instead, once they were airborne, voice crackling faint through the headset. Harlow's hand tightened on the strap of her harness. "You knew her? Knew of her? Flew supply drops out near her old place a couple times years back before she went quiet on everybody. Good woman, sharp eyes. Never said 2 words more than she needed to." Otis adjusted a dial without looking at it, the motion pure muscle memory. "You've got her look about you. Same way of watching a room like, you already know where the exits are before anybody tells you." People keep saying that, probably because it's true. He glanced back at her just once, something almost gentle in the weathered creases around his eyes. "Whatever you're flying into today, kid, I hope it's worth it." "So do I," Harlow said, and meant it more than she expected to. She spent the rest of the flight watching the terrain change beneath them, forest giving way slowly to bare granite, and found herself, without quite meaning to, running the same mental checklist Eleanor used to run out loud on every hike of Harlow's childhood. Wind direction, elevation change, distance to the nearest tree line for cover. The habits lived in her whether she called on them or not, quiet and constant, the way a heartbeat runs without needing permission. The mountains came up fast beneath them, white and merciless and beautiful in the specific way that only truly dangerous places manage to be beautiful. Like the land itself knew it didn't need to try to impress anyone. It simply was. And you either respected that, or you didn't survive long enough to regret not respecting it. Harlow pressed her forehead briefly to the cold window glass, watched the tree line give way to bare rock, watched the rock give way to a white so total it erased the horizon. Somewhere down there her grandmother had walked, decades ago, carrying a rifle and a secret that would take her granddaughter this long to even begin to understand. Somewhere down there, 6 people were missing, or dead, or worse. And somewhere down there, Silas Marrow's company had built something it needed hidden badly enough to let people disappear rather than risk it being found. The helicopter shuddered as a gust caught the tail rotor, a hard lurch that threw Harlow sideways against her harness. Otis cursed low and steady, hands sure on the controls, correcting before the shudder could become a spiral. "Weather's turning faster than forecast," he called back. "Gonna be a rough set-down." "How rough?" Marisol asked. "Rough enough that once I'm gone, I'm gone. No return window for at least 18 hours, maybe more." Harlow met Bridger's eyes across the cabin. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything left to say that the silence didn't already cover. Marisol broke it anyway, because Marisol always broke silences that went on too long, calling it a professional allergy she'd never bothered curing. "Hey, Reyes." She leaned forward against her harness, voice pitched just under the engine noise. "Whatever's down there, whatever we find, you don't have to carry it alone once we land. That's the whole point of a team, you know that, right?" "I know. I don't think you do, actually. I think you've spent so many years being the only person who knew any of this that you've forgotten what it feels like to share the weight." Marisol's expression, usually quick with humor, had gone unusually serious. "So I'm telling you now, before we're on the ground and it's too late to say it. Whatever this costs, it's not just your cost anymore. We chose this too." Harlow felt something loosen in her chest, small but real, and she nodded because her voice wasn't quite steady enough yet to answer properly. Because this was the moment, the one that always came, in every mission she'd ever run, the moment where the plan stopped being a plan and started being real, where all the calibrated scopes and backup batteries and careful preparation collapsed down into a single fact. They were about to be alone in country that wanted them dead, chasing an answer that a woman she'd loved more than anyone alive had spent 40 years trying to outrun. The helicopter dropped low over a ridge Harlow recognized without ever having seen it. Recognized the way you recognize a stranger's face that happens to share your own eyes, your own mouth, some genetic echo too precise to be coincidence. Below them, through breaks in blowing snow, a cluster of low buildings emerged. Utilitarian, windowless on the north face. Exactly the kind of structure built by people who never intended for anyone to look inside. No lights, no movement, no sign of 6 missing contractors, no sign of anyone at all. Just silence and snow, and a facility that had been waiting. Harlow understood suddenly, waiting for exactly this. For someone with her last name to finally come looking. Otis found a flat shelf of rock a quarter-mile out and set them down hard, the skids biting into wind-packed snow, the rotor wash kicking up a whiteout that swallowed the world for 10 full seconds before it cleared. They unloaded fast, practiced, wordless. 18 hours, Otis reminded them, shouting over the engine. "Radio if that changes. Otherwise I'm back at first light tomorrow." Then he was gone, the helicopter lifting away into gray sky, the sound of it fading until there was nothing left but wind, and the 3 of them at a facility crouched half a mile ahead like something asleep. Or something waiting. They moved in single file, Bridger on point, Marisol rear guard, Harlow in the middle where she could read the terrain the way her grandmother taught her, watching the tree line for the same sheer layer she'd shown a class of strangers just days earlier, a lifetime earlier, though it had barely been a week. The facility's main door hung open 6 inches. Snow had drifted inside, undisturbed, meaning it had been open for days, meaning whoever left last left in a hurry and never came back to close it behind them. Bridger held up a fist, stopped them 30 yards out. "No vehicle tracks," he said quietly. "No footprints leaving. Only going in. So they're still inside," Marisol said. "Or they never left the way they came." Harlow raised her scope, scanned the tree line to their left, the ridge above, the long empty approach to the building's entrance. Something about the stillness felt wrong in a way she couldn't yet name. A wrongness that lived somewhere below conscious thought, the same instinct that used to make her freeze mid-step as a child. Half a beat before Eleanor's voice would cut across the yard with a single word of warning. Down, wait, listen. She hadn't heard that voice in years. She heard it now, faint but unmistakable, riding somewhere just underneath her own pulse. And that was when she saw it. A flicker of motion in the trees 200 yards out, gone as fast as it appeared, the kind of movement that could be wind-shaken branches, could be an animal, could be nothing. Except her gut said otherwise. Except every instinct her grandmother had spent a childhood building into her muscle memory was screaming the same word, over and over, the word she'd learned before she ever learned to be afraid of using it. Ambush. Down, she said, and didn't wait to see if they listened, because she was already moving, already dropping into the snow as the first shot cracked across the open ground, close enough that she heard it split the air a full half-second before understanding caught up to instinct. They weren't here to find a missing survey team. They were the survey team's replacement. The next 6 people Corvid Dynamics needed to disappear. And somewhere behind that open door, in a building her grandmother had refused to let finish its work 40 years ago, the answer to everything Eleanor Ashworth had spent her whole life running from was still waiting. Harlow just had to survive long enough to find it. The second shot came a half-second behind the first, and Harlow felt the snow kick up inches from her shoulder before her brain finished processing the sound. Down. Stay down. Move anyway. She rolled twice, came up behind a boulder the size of a truck cab, and pressed her spine flat against stone so cold it burned through her jacket like a brand. Bridger was already returning fire from a fold in the terrain 20 yards to her left. 3 controlled shots, the muzzle flash swallowed almost instantly by blowing snow. Marisol had gone to ground somewhere behind them, radio crackling, voice clipped. 2 shooters, Marisol said. Maybe 3. Ridge line, 11 o'clock. Copy. Harlow's voice didn't sound like her own. Flat. Fast. The voice her grandmother used to use. The one Harlow had spent her whole life half mimicking without knowing why. Bridger, can you get eyes on the second position? Working on it. Except he wasn't working on it fast enough. Which meant she had maybe 10 seconds before the shooters adjusted, before they stopped guessing at shapes in the whiteout and started finding them for real. She came up over the boulder's edge just far enough to sight through her scope, found motion. A shape in white-gray camouflage, moving low along a shelf of rock 200 yards out, rifle already shouldered. She didn't think. Thinking was too slow. Her finger found the trigger the way it had found 10,000 triggers before this one, the way her grandmother had drilled into her hands, until the motion lived somewhere below conscious thought. She fired. The shape dropped. Whether it was dead or diving for cover, she'd never know, because the return fire came instantly, 3 rounds chewing into the boulder above her head, close enough that stone chips stung her cheek like wasps. Harlow, fall back! Bridger's voice ragged now, urgent. There's more of them than we counted. How many more? I don't know. Just move, she moved. Low fat, boots punching through crusted snow that gave way to softer powder underneath, the kind that swallowed a foot to the ankle and threatened to swallow it deeper if you slowed even a half step. Behind her, gunfire kept coming, and somewhere in the chaos she lost count of whose shots were whose, lost the careful tactical math she'd trained her whole life to keep running in the back of her skull, because that was the thing about ambushes. They didn't care how prepared you were. They only cared how fast you adapted once the plan you'd built collapsed. And this one was collapsing fast. She reached a stand of black spruce, dove behind the thickest trunk, pressed her back to bark rough enough to tear through her glove. Scanned. Bridger 30 yards back now, exchanging fire with someone she couldn't see. Marisol nowhere. Nowhere she could see, which was its own kind of terror. A hole in her mental map where a person should be. Marisol! She shouted into the radio. Status! Static! Marisol, respond. More static. And underneath it, faint, garbled, a voice that wasn't Marisol's at all. A man's voice. Calm. Almost amused. She's fine, Ms. Reyes. For now. Harlow's stomach dropped through the snow beneath her boots. Who is this? You know who this is. A pause, unhurried. The kind of pause that belonged to someone who already believed he'd won. I told you I needed 40 minutes of your time. Consider this the second half of that conversation. Desmond Cray. She should have known. She had known. Some buried animal part of her. From the very first phone call. From the way he sat too still on her porch steps. From the way he never once asked a question he didn't already know the answer to. She'd ignored it. Told herself the coordinates mattered more than the messenger. And now Marisol was gone. And Bridger was pinned down. And Harlow Reyes was alone behind a tree in country cold enough to kill her in under 2 hours without a single bullet ever finding her. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to walk toward the facility. Alone, leave your rifle. Your friend stays breathing as long as you cooperate. You'll kill her either way. Probably." His voice didn't change at all when he said it, which was somehow worse than if he'd sounded cruel. "But not in the next 5 minutes. Which is longer than you'll have if you keep hiding behind that tree." The radio clicked dead. Harlow pressed her forehead against cold bark and made herself breathe. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Her grandmother's counting drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why a child needed to control her own panic on command. Because panic gets people killed. Because hesitation gets people killed. Because the only thing standing between her and every terrible outcome branching out from this exact moment was whether she could think clearly for the next 60 seconds. She couldn't save Marisol by walking into a trap. She couldn't save Bridger by freezing behind a tree. Which left exactly one option. The same option her grandmother's notebook had been quietly pointing toward for 3 days now, ever since Harlow first read those coordinates out loud in her own kitchen. Get to the facility. Not because Desmond told her to, because whatever was inside it was the only leverage she had left. She moved. The next 4 minutes blurred into something her memory would never fully reconstruct in order. Gunfire. Snow kicked up in violent little geysers. Bridger's voice once, shouting her name, and then nothing. No second shout, which she refused to let herself interpret as anything final. She went down once, hard, her boot catching a buried root under 3 inches of powder, and came up with her palm bleeding through a torn glove, and no memory of how the glove had torn. And then the round found her. She didn't hear this one coming. There wasn't time to hear it. There was only the impact, high on her left side, just below the collarbone. A force like being hit with a sledgehammer wrapped in fire, and she was on the ground before her mind finished registering the word shot. For a moment, there was no pain at all. Just a strange ringing silence and the sky spinning slow gray circles above her. Then the pain arrived all at once, and it was enormous, and she heard herself make a sound she didn't recognize as her own voice. "Move, move or die here. Move." She rolled onto her uninjured side, pressed her good hand hard against the wound, felt heat and wet soaking through in a way that some clinical, distant part of her brain immediately cataloged as bad, very bad. Arterial maybe, or close to it. She had maybe minutes before blood loss started stealing her ability to think straight, maybe less. Voices behind her now closer. Men's voices, moving through the trees, unhurried. Confident, the voices of people who believed the hard part was already finished. She could not let them find her here. She dragged herself upright against a spruce trunk, black spots crawling at the edges of her vision, and made herself walk, stagger. Whatever the movement was, kept her upright and kept her moving away from the voices, deeper into a stand of trees so thick the light barely penetrated even in daylight, and daylight was already dying fast around her. The sky bruising toward the particular early dark that swallowed this part of Alaska whole for 16 hours at a stretch this time of year. She didn't know how long she walked. Time stopped meaning anything specific. There was only the next tree, the next 20 feet, the next breath, ragged, tasting of copper and cold, until the voices behind her faded, until the gunfire stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so total it felt like its own kind of threat, until her legs simply stopped agreeing to hold her weight, and she went down into snow that felt, for one disorienting second, almost warm. That was the first sign. She knew that. Some clinical fragment of her training surfaced through the fog and told her calmly that the snow was not warm, that her body was lying to her, that this particular lie was the first stage of something that killed people faster than bullets did out here. Get up. She didn't get up. Get up, Harlow, now. The voice in her head wasn't entirely her own anymore. It had her grandmother's cadence to it. Clipped and certain, The exact tone Eleanor used when a 9-year-old wanted to quit 2 hours into a training hike and was not, under any circumstances, going to be allowed to. Harlow got up. She found a depression in the rock face maybe 30 yards further on, a shallow overhang that cut the worst of the wind, and she collapsed into it, with what strength remained in her legs. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this was where she would either survive the night or she would not. Her radio was dead, crushed sometime during the fall, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. Her rifle was gone, dropped somewhere in the trees behind her, and she had no memory of dropping it, which frightened her more than the wound did. Her jacket was soaked through on the left side, the blood beginning to freeze at its edges into something crusted and dark. Because this was how it happened. This was exactly how her grandmother must have felt once, decades ago, alone in country just like this, deciding in real time whether to survive or whether survival simply cost more than she had left to spend. Except Eleanor had survived. Eleanor had lived to be an old woman with silver hair and steady hands, who taught her granddaughter to read wind through tree branches like it was the most natural thing in the world, which meant it could be done, which meant Harlow could do it too. She pulled her good arm inside her jacket, pressed her palm hard against the wound, and began slowly, deliberately, to build a shelter with whatever her one working hand could manage. Snow packed against the overhang's open face, branches dragged in and layered for insulation. Every motion cost her more than it should have. Every motion made her vision swim and her breath come shorter. But she kept moving, because stopping meant something she refused to name even inside her own head. By the time full dark came down, she had a shelter that might hold enough warmth to keep her alive until morning. Might. The word felt enormous now, a word she'd never given much weight to before tonight. She sat with her back against stone and her knees pulled to her chest and her breath fogging out in front of her face in ragged little clouds. And she let herself finally be afraid. Because she was alone. Because she was shot. Because somewhere out there Bridger might be dead, Marisol might be dead, and the two people she trusted most in the world had walked into this mountain because she asked them to, which was the thought that undid her more than the pain did, more than the cold did. She pressed her forehead to her knees and let herself shake, silently, for exactly as long as she allowed herself to fall apart, which her grandmother's training had taught her, decades ago, to measure and to limit. 60 seconds. She counted them. At 60, she lifted her head and she made herself stop, because falling apart didn't build a fire. Falling apart didn't stop the bleeding. Falling apart was a luxury for people who had somewhere warm to fall apart in. And Harlow Reyes did not currently have that luxury, and grief would still be there in the morning, if she lived long enough to feel it properly. She found a small emergency kit sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one her grandmother had taught her to always carry and never mention, and inside it, packed tight, a compressed gauze pad and a strip of medical tape that would have to do the work of things far more sophisticated than themselves. Her hand shook. Cold did that. Blood loss did that. She packed the wound anyway, taped it as tightly as one working hand allowed, and bit down hard enough on her own lip to taste blood there too, a second smaller pain that somehow made the larger one bearable by comparison. The temperature kept falling. She could feel it in the way the air itself seemed to sharpen, the way each breath began to burn a little more on the way in. Somewhere past midnight, by her best guess, with no way left to check a clock, the cold crossed some threshold her body understood before her mind did, a threshold that meant this was no longer merely dangerous. This was the kind of cold that killed people who did everything right. -71 degrees, she would learn later, though in the moment there was no number attached to it at all. There was only the cold itself, vast and patient, settling over the mountain like something with intention behind it. She thought of her grandmother's hands, steady on a rifle stock, steady braiding Harlow's hair before school, steady the one time Harlow had asked, point blank, what happened up north all those years ago, and Eleanor's hands had gone very still on the kitchen counter, still in a way that meant the question would not be answered, not that day, not ever, as it turned out, not while she was alive to answer it. Harlow understood now, sitting in a stone hollow, bleeding and freezing at the edge of consciousness, that her grandmother's silence had never been about protecting a secret. It had been about protecting her, which meant Eleanor had known, somehow, that this exact night might come. That someone she loved might end up exactly here, cold and alone and running out of options, chasing the same ridge Eleanor herself had spent 40 years running from. Except knowing that didn't stop it from happening. It only meant Eleanor had prepared her granddaughter, piece by piece, skill by skill, for a night she never lived to see arrive. Harlow's vision blurred, not from tears this time, from something colder, something that felt like her mind slowly detaching from her body the way ice detaches from a riverbank, first at the edges, then all at once. She forced her eyes open, forced herself to focus on something, anything, a fixed point, to keep her tethered. The notebook. She hadn't brought the physical book, had left it locked in a drawer back at the cabin where it would be safe. But she had photographed the pages, years ago, every single one, in a folder on her phone she rarely opened. 'Cause opening it always felt like intruding on a woman who'd spent her whole life guarding her privacy, even from her own family. Her phone, at least, still had a sliver of battery, enough for one more thing. She pulled it from an inner pocket with fingers that barely obeyed her, and she opened the folder, and she found the page she was looking for almost by instinct, the page dated deep in 1978, the page she had read so many times the shape of the handwriting lived behind her eyelids now. They came back tonight, the entry read, "Marrow again, younger than the others but colder somehow. He didn't threaten me directly, he didn't have to. He just described very calmly what happened to test subjects who refused the fourth trial voluntarily versus the ones who were made to complete it anyway. I understood the difference he was drawing. I understood exactly what he meant me to understand. I said no. I will keep saying no until they stop asking or until they stop needing my answer at all." Harlow read it 3 times before the meaning she'd always half understood finally arrived whole and complete and devastating, because this was never about Eleanor refusing a job. This was about Eleanor refusing to become something, a test subject, a body used to measure how much suffering a human frame could absorb in extreme cold before it broke past any hope of repair. And the program hadn't stopped needing an answer. It had simply waited. Decades. Long enough for the woman who refused to die of old age. Long enough for her granddaughter to walk, unknowing, straight back into the same trap, wearing a different name. Which meant the ambush tonight was never only about silencing witnesses to a missing survey team. Which meant Harlow herself was the trial Silas Marrow had been waiting 40 years to finally run. The thought should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, it arrived with a strange, cold clarity. The same clarity she imagined her grandmother must have felt the night she said no and meant it. She was not going to be Silas Marrow's data point. She was going to survive this mountain, and then she was going to make sure the entire world understood exactly what he had spent 4 decades trying to bury. Because there was more to the entry than the words on the page. Because Harlow had spent years imagining the scene behind them, piecing it together from fragments. From the way her grandmother's hand pressed so hard into certain words that the pen had nearly torn the paper. She let herself imagine it now. Half delirious, half desperate for something to hold on to besides the cold. A briefing room. Fluorescent light, the ugly kind, humming faintly overhead. Eleanor, 32 years old, seated across a metal table from 3 men in wool coats, and a 4th man standing in the corner, younger than the rest, saying nothing, watching everything. "You understand the opportunity we're offering," the man across the table would have said. Calm, reasonable, the voice of someone who had never once been told no and fully expected that streak to continue. "I understand what you're offering," Eleanor would have answered. "I'm declining it. The 4th trial isn't optional, Ms. Ashworth. Not at this stage of the program. Then make it optional. Or find someone else." A pause. A long one. And then, from the corner, the younger man would have finally spoken, quiet, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Corwin didn't think it was optional either," he'd have said. "Until it was over. And afterward he understood we'd only ever been protecting him from a worse outcome. Corwin's hands shake so badly now he can't hold a coffee cup. Corwin is alive." Eleanor would have looked at him then, really looked, the way she taught Harlow to look at a threat, cataloging it, measuring it, deciding exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend fighting it. "What's your name?" she'd have asked. "Silas Marrow. You're young to be in this room, Mr. Marrow." I'm young enough to still believe the work matters. Give it a few more years. I imagine I'll believe it even more. Harlow couldn't know, whether the conversation had unfolded anything like this. The notebook never recorded dialogue, only impressions, only the aftertaste of encounters Eleanor clearly never wanted to relive in full. But something in her bones told her the shape of it was close enough. Close enough that she understood, finally, completely, why her grandmother had spent the rest of her life flinching at gray winter light. Because Silas Marrow had not been the monster in that room. Not yet. He'd been young, and certain, and patient in the particular way of men who believe time is always on their side. 40 years later, it apparently still was. The night stretched on in a way that stopped feeling like hours and started feeling like something closer to geological time. Slow and enormous and indifferent to her presence inside it. She fought sleep the way her grandmother had taught her to fight it, counting backward from 100 in increments of 7, reciting facts about wind resistance and bullet drop under different barometric conditions. Anything to keep her mind occupied and moving, because a mind that stopped moving in this cold was a mind that stopped waking up. At some point, she lost the thread entirely. At some point, the cold stopped feeling like cold at all, and started feeling almost gentle, almost like being wrapped in something soft. And some distant clinical part of her recognized this too, recognized it as the cruelest lie hypothermia told, the lie that made people lie down in snowbanks and never get up again because their dying brain had convinced them, at the very end, that they were simply comfortable. She thought of her mother, then, Marguerite, a woman Harlow hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years, not since a fight neither of them had ever properly apologized for. A fight about nothing, really, about everything. About the particular exhausting weight of 2 women who loved each other and could not, for reasons neither fully understood, find their way back to saying so. She thought, if this was the end, she would have liked to say it, just once, plainly, without an argument attached. I love you. I don't understand you, but I love you. The thought arrived and then dissolved, the way most thoughts were dissolving now, drifting apart before she could hold on to their shape. Her eyes closed. She did not decide to close them. They simply closed, the way a door closes on its own weight when nothing holds it open any longer. And the last thing she registered before the darkness took her whole was a sound. Distant, rhythmic, growing louder. Rotor blades. She could not lift her head to confirm it, could not make her mouth form any sound at all. She simply lay there, half buried in snow that no longer felt cold, and let the sound exist somewhere at the very edge of her fading awareness, unsure if it was real or only the last trick her dying mind intended to play on her. 40 minutes earlier, and 11,000 feet up, Chief Nathaniel Emery Vasquez had been running pre-flight checks on a survival pack he'd already checked twice, because that was simply how Vasquez operated under pressure, methodical to the point of obsession, a habit that had saved more lives over 14 years of service than he could accurately count anymore. You're going to wear a hole in that zipper, said Senior Chief Holt Bannerman from the seat across the cabin, watching Vasquez's hands move over the pack for a third pass. Zipper's fine. I'm not. You never are, before extraction. Extraction implies I know what I'm extracting. Vasquez zipped the pack shut, finally, and looked up. SOS ping came off a private satellite unit, encrypted, registered to a survival instructor out of a cabin 40 miles south of the target coordinates. No military ID, no service record we can access. Just a name. What name? Reyes. Harlow Reyes. Bannerman went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid math in his head. Reyes. That name means something to you? Not directly. Vasquez frowned, turning the name over. But something about it's familiar. Can't place it. Place it later. We've got a 90-minute window before this storm system closes the ridge entirely, and Command wants boots on that mountain before whatever's happening up there finishes happening. The Black Hawk lifted off into weather that would have grounded a less experienced crew entirely. Snow coming sideways across the windshield in sheets thick enough to swallow the horizon whole. Vasquez had flown into worse. Barely. He kept that thought to himself. Talk to me about the facility, he said, pulling up satellite imagery on a tablet screwed into the seat back in front of him. Corvi Dynamics. Private contractor, cold weather testing, officially. Bannerman's voice carried the particular flatness of a man reading between lines he didn't like. Unofficially, We've got chatter suggesting the facility's been running something well outside its charter for a long time. Command's been trying to get eyes on it for 8 months. Every request gets buried before it clears review. Buried how? Buried like somebody with rank is doing the burying. Vasquez let that sit. In 14 years, he'd learned exactly what silence like that usually meant, and none of the meanings were good. 6 civilian contractors went dark 9 days ago, Bannerman continued. Then a second civilian team went in after them. Now we've got an SOS from someone outside both teams entirely. Command thinks it's connected. Command's usually right about that kind of thing. Command's usually right about a lot of things it won't say out loud. The flight took 51 minutes, each one longer than the last, as the storm worsened. The Black Hawk fighting crosswinds that shoved it sideways in gusts, hard enough to rattle teeth. Vasquez kept his eyes on the tablet, watching the SOS beacon's last known position, a fixed point on the mountain that hadn't moved in over 3 hours, which was either very good news or very bad news, and there was no way to know which until they were standing over it. Beacon stationary, he said quietly. I see it. Stationary this long in this cold? I know what stationary this long in this cold usually means, Vasquez. Bannerman's mouth pressed into a hard line. Let's just get there. They got there. The pilot found a break in the storm just wide enough to set down 400 yards from the beacon's position, close enough to close the distance on foot in under 15 minutes if the terrain cooperated. It did not cooperate. Vasquez and Bannerman moved through snow that swallowed them to the knee in places, headlamps cutting narrow cones of visibility through a darkness so total it felt almost physical, a weight pressing in from every direction at once. 200 yards, Bannerman called, tracking the beacon on a handheld unit. Bearing 045. Copy. They moved faster. Vasquez felt his own breath burning in his throat, the cold aggressive enough to punish every exposed inch of skin within seconds, and he thought, distantly, professionally, that survival time out here for an unprotected casualty would be measured in minutes, not hours, which meant if Harlow Reyes had been down for 3 hours already. He didn't finish the thought, didn't let himself. There, Bannerman said, and his headlamp beam swept across a shallow rock overhang, half collapsed under drifted snow, and inside it, barely visible, a shape. Vasquez reached her first. He dropped to his knees in the snow, tore his glove off with his teeth to check for a pulse at her throat, and for one long, terrible second he felt nothing at all, nothing but cold skin and stillness, and a jolt of dread went through him fast and cold. Then, faint, thready. But there. I've got a pulse, he called, voice cracking with something that wasn't quite professional composure anymore. Weak. Get the thermal wrap now. Bannerman moved fast, unpacking a reflective thermal shell with hands that had done this exact motion 100 times before, and never quite this fast. Together they worked her gently from the overhang, careful of the crude field dressing crusted dark against her shoulder, careful of a body that had gone rigid with cold in ways that made every movement feel like it might be the one that broke something irreparable. Core temps got to be in the 80s, Bannerman said grimly, reading a thermometer pressed briefly to her skin. Maybe lower. She's alive. Barely. Barely's enough. Vasquez wrapped the thermal shell tight around her, lifted her as carefully as the terrain allowed, and started back toward the helicopter at a pace just short of reckless. Get command on the line. Tell them we need a medevac, standing by the second we're wheels down. Tell them she's critical. They moved through snow that fought them every step, wind screaming across the exposed ridge like something alive and furious at being denied. And the whole way back Vasquez kept his eyes on Harlow's face, pale and still against the thermal wrap, watching for any flicker of movement that would tell him she was still fighting somewhere down inside that stillness. At the helicopter, the pilot had the cabin heat running at maximum, and they laid her across the bench seat and began the slow, careful work of warming a body that had come as close to the edge as a body could come and still, technically, be called alive. Bannerman worked in silence for a long moment, checking vitals, adjusting the wrap, and then he stopped entirely, his hand going still against the emergency medical tag clipped inside her jacket collar, a standard piece of gear that listed blood type and allergies and in smaller print beneath a next of kin. He read it twice. Vasquez. What? Her file. Emergency contact. Bannerman's voice had gone strange careful, the voice of a man encountering a ghost in broad daylight. next of kin's marked deceased. But there's a second name listed under previous guardian. Bannerman. We don't have time.
Ashworth.
Bannerman looked up, and something in his expression made Vasquez go still, despite the urgency screaming through every other part of him. Eleanor Ashworth. The name landed in the small heated cabin like something dropped from a great height. Vasquez knew that name, had known it for years, buried under a decade and a half of other names, other missions, other faces he'd trained beside and bled beside and, in a handful of cases, watched die beside. Eleanor Ashworth was not a name from his own service record. It was a name from a story told to him once, late at night, by a mentor long since retired, a story about a woman who'd been the finest shot most of that mentor's generation had ever witnessed, a woman the old programs had tried and failed to fold into their machinery, decades before Vasquez had ever put on a uniform. A woman his mentor had described, more than once, with something close to reverence in his voice. "That's not possible," Vasquez said slowly. "Check the tag yourself." He did, it was true. Harlow Reyes, unconscious and barely breathing on the bench seat in front of him, was Eleanor Ashworth's granddaughter, which meant this was never simply a rescue mission gone complicated, which meant Vasquez had just pulled the last living piece of a story his mentor once called the closest thing to a ghost their whole community still quietly, carefully, refused to speak about, out of a snowbank 40 miles from a facility that command couldn't get anyone to officially investigate, which meant whatever happened next on this mountain was about to become a great deal more complicated than a routine extraction. "Get her stable," Vasquez said finally, forcing his voice back into something steady, something that belonged to the job in front of him, rather than the questions exploding behind it. "Everything else waits until she's breathing easy on her own." Bannerman nodded, returned to the careful, patient work of warming a body pulled back from country that did not, as a rule, give people back. The helicopter lifted off into the storm, carrying Harlow Reyes away from the mountain that had nearly killed her, away from the ridge her grandmother had spent 40 years refusing to speak of, and somewhere in that careful, urgent silence, Vasquez found himself staring at her pale, still face and thinking about a story he'd heard exactly once, years ago, about a woman who said no to a machine built to grind people down and who paid for that no with a lifetime spent hiding. He didn't know yet how deep this went. Didn't know about Desmond Cray's betrayal on the ridge below, or about Bridger Callahan lying wounded in the snows 2 miles east, alive but barely, or about Marisol Andreca bound and freezing inside the very facility they were about to lose their extraction window to reach. He only knew that the woman in front of him had survived something that should have killed her twice over, and that survival, out here, in weather like this, was rarely an accident. It was, more often than not, exactly what it looked like. A message, sent by someone who refused all the way down to her bones to simply lie down and disappear. Somewhere below them, back on the mountain, the facility's lights flickered on in the dark, one building at a time, as though something inside had just realized the trial it had been waiting 40 years to complete had, against every calculation, survived the night. And somewhere inside that same facility, in a room with no windows and a single steel door, Marisol Andreca sat bound to a metal chair, cold and furious and very much alive, listening to footsteps approach down a concrete hallway and preparing herself, the only way she knew how, for whatever came through that door next. She would not go quietly. She had never once in her whole life gone quietly. The door opened. A man stepped through, unhurried, wearing a gray fleece with no insignia, no name tape, nothing that identified him as belonging to anything at all, which was its own kind of statement, which told Marisol exactly how careful this operation intended to be about ever officially existing. "You're not the talkative type," he said, pulling a folding chair from against the wall and setting it across from her, close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath, cheap and burnt. "That's fine. Most people talk eventually. Where's my team? One's dead." "Probably. Weather like that. Hard to say for certain." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder, a fact stated the way you'd state a delivery estimate. "The other's on her way to becoming considerably more interesting to us than either of you realize." "What does that mean?" "It means Silas is going to want to meet her personally, which is more than most people get." Marisol's wrists strained against the zip tie, binding them to the chair's metal frame. A motion small enough not to be noticed, testing give that wasn't there. She kept her face still, kept her voice flatter than she felt. You work for a man who disappeared survey teams. That's who you're loyal to. I work for a man who spent 4 decades trying to finish something that actually matters. The man leaned back, unbothered. You wouldn't understand it. Most people don't, until they've seen what the technology can do, what it's supposed to do once it's finished properly. Finished on whose body? He didn't answer that. Didn't need to. The silence did the answering for him, and Marisol felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. You're going to sit here, he said, standing, folding the chair back against the wall with a precision that suggested habit, routine. A man who had done exactly this to exactly this kind of prisoner more than once before. And you're going to think very carefully about what you know and what you're willing to trade for a warmer room. I'll be back in an hour. He left. The steel door sealed shut behind him with a sound like a held breath finally released. Marisol sat alone in the cold and the silence, and she did not cry, and she did not panic, and she began instead, methodically, the way she'd been trained to begin, to work the zip tie against the chair's sharp edge, one slow inch at a time, because an hour was an hour, and an hour, if she used every second of it, might be enough. And 2 miles east, half buried in a drift that had very nearly become his grave, Bridger Callahan opened his eyes to a gray, merciless sky, felt the deep, aching cold that meant he was still somehow alive, and began slowly, painfully, the work of getting back on his feet, because Harlow was still out there somewhere. Because Marisol was still out there somewhere. Because whatever this mountain had taken from him tonight, it had not yet taken the one thing that mattered most. It had not taken his reason to keep moving. He got up. Except getting up turned out to be the easy part. Standing was one thing. Standing and staying upright while his left leg screamed with every shift of weight, while the wound above his knee had gone from burning to a deep, hollow throb that worried him more than the pain itself. That was a different kind of fight entirely. He started walking. One step, then another. Which was, he told himself, the entire secret to staying alive out here, had always been the entire secret. Going back to places far from this mountain, places he didn't let himself think about except in the smallest, most necessary doses. You didn't survive the whole night. You survived the next step, and then the one after that. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened. Wind driving snow sideways hard enough to sting any patch of exposed skin within seconds. And Bridger pulled his hood tighter and kept his eyes fixed on a rock formation he'd marked in his mind before the light failed completely, using it now as a bearing the same way Harlow had taught him to read a sheer layer in the trees, watching for the shapes that stayed constant when everything else in the world was moving. Because somewhere behind him, maybe a mile back, maybe less, Harlow had gone down. He'd heard it. A sound he would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember too precisely, the particular cry a person makes when a body absorbs an impact it wasn't built to absorb. He hadn't been able to reach her, hadn't been able to do anything except keep 3 armed men occupied long enough that they stopped hunting in her direction, which had cost him a bullet through the meat of his thigh, and very nearly cost him considerably more than that, which he'd have paid gladly, which he'd pay again, without hesitation, if the mountain asked. Except the mountain wasn't finished asking yet. He went down once, hard, his bad leg buckling without warning, and for a long moment he simply lay in the snow and let himself consider, honestly, whether getting up again was still inside the range of things his body was willing to do. It was not a pleasant thought. It arrived anyway, the way true thoughts tend to arrive uninvited, at the worst possible moment, without asking permission. He thought of Marisol's voice on the radio, calm even as chaos closed in around her. He thought of Harlow's face in the kitchen 3 nights ago, steady even while she admitted, for the first time out loud, that this had stopped being only a rescue mission somewhere around the moment Desmond Cray said her grandmother's coordinates. He thought, absurdly, of nothing at all for a moment, just the wind, just the particular gray-white nothing of a blizzard at close range, beautiful in a way that felt like it was daring him to stop fighting it. He got up anyway, because someone had to still be standing when this was over. Because the alternative wasn't something he was willing to hand this mountain. Not tonight, not after everything it had already taken. He started walking again, slower now, favoring the leg that still obeyed him, and somewhere in the third hour of that walk, half frozen and bleeding and running purely on will at that point, he saw a light through the trees. Not a rescue light. Not yet. A window, a cabin, or something like one, tucked into a fold of the mountain that hadn't shown up on any map he'd studied before this mission began. He didn't know, yet, whether it belonged to Corvide Dynamics or to something else entirely. Didn't know whether walking toward it was the smartest decision he'd made all night or the last one he'd ever make. He walked toward it anyway. Because stopping had never once in his whole life been the plan. The storm howled around him, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere far above, invisible now behind the weather, a helicopter carried the woman who'd brought them all to this mountain toward a hospital bed, where doctors would spend the next several hours simply trying to convince her body that it was allowed, after everything, to go on living. It would take 3 days before Harlow opened her eyes again. It would take longer than that before she understood exactly how close she'd come to becoming precisely what Silas Marrow had spent 40 years waiting for. But not tonight. Tonight she was simply, impossibly, still breathing. And on a mountain built to erase people who ask too many questions. That alone was its own kind of answer. Because somewhere below the storm, in a facility with no windows and a chairman who had waited 40 years for exactly this outcome, a phone rang in an office kept far too warm for the mountain outside its walls. Silas Marrow answered it on the second ring, listened, said nothing for a long moment. "She's alive," he finally said, and there was no anger in his voice at all, only something quieter, something almost like satisfaction. "Of course she's alive. She's Eleanor's blood." He set the phone down, looked out through reinforced glass at a storm that had, in 4 decades of waiting, never once managed to finish what it started. Neither had he. Not yet, but he had learned, a very long time ago, in a briefing room under fluorescent light that hummed too loudly, that patience was the only tool this particular work ever truly required. He had waited 40 years for the daughter of the woman who told him no. He could wait a little longer for the granddaughter to wake up. The first thing Harlow understood, before her eyes even opened, was the sound of a heart monitor keeping time with something that was, unmistakably, still her own pulse, which meant she wasn't dead, which seemed for one disoriented moment like information worth double-checking. She opened her eyes to fluorescent light, softer than the light in her half-imagined vision of that briefing room decades ago, and a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped vaguely like the state of Texas. And beyond that, a window showing gray daylight and a parking lot dusted with fresh snow. A hospital. Anchorage, judging by the signage on a rolling cart near the door. Her left shoulder throbbed with a deep, chemical dullness that told her, even before she looked, that someone had been generous with the morphine drip taped to her wrist. Her fingers, when she flexed them experimentally, obeyed. Slowly, painfully, but they obeyed. Alive then. Genuinely, fully alive. And not simply the last extended flicker of a dying mind convincing itself otherwise. "You're awake." The voice came from a chair pulled close to the bed, and Harlow turned her head, wincing, to find Bridger sitting there, one leg elevated and wrapped, dark circles under his eyes deep enough to look almost bruised, watching her with an expression she'd never once seen on his face in all the years she'd known him. Relief. Raw, unguarded relief. "You're alive," she rasped, her voice a stranger's voice, cracked and thin. "Barely. Same as you." He leaned forward, careful of his own leg. "You've been out 3 days. 3. She tried to sit up. Regretted it instantly, pain flaring bright and sharp through her shoulder. Marisol. Down the hall. Broken wrist, mild frostbite, and in significantly better spirits than either of us has any right to be in. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She talked her way out of that chair before the SEAL team even reached the facility. Cut through a zip tie with a sharpened belt buckle and walked out through a maintenance corridor like she owned the place. Harlow let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except laughing hurt too much to fully commit to. Marisol told her the rest herself 2 days later, sitting cross-legged on the end of Harlow's hospital bed with her wrist in a bright cast, recounting the story with the particular relish of someone who'd earned the right to enjoy it. He left me alone exactly 58 minutes, Marisol said. Not an hour. 58. Overconfident men always round up in their own favor. She held up her cast like a trophy. Chair frame had a burr on one leg where the weld hadn't been ground down properly. Took me 20 minutes to fray through the tie. Another 15 to get the door unlatched from the inside, because whoever installed that lock clearly never expected anyone to survive long enough to try. She grinned, fierce and unbothered. I walked out through a maintenance corridor in a stolen fleece jacket, found their motor pool, and was 3 miles down the access road on a snowmobile before anyone even noticed the room was empty. You could have died out there alone. I could have died in that chair too. Marisol shrugged, the gesture entirely too casual for what she was describing. At least outside, I got to pick the way I went down fighting instead of waiting politely for permission. Harlow shook her head, something between exasperation and fierce, grateful affection rising in her chest. I need you to stop being this calm about nearly dying. It's unsettling. No promises. Marisol's grin softened, just slightly. I'm glad you're still here, Reyes, for what it's worth. Same. What about you? Harlow asked, looking to Bridger. I heard you went down. Bad. Bridger's mouth pressed into a hard line, the memory clearly still close to the surface. Leg took a round. Kept walking anyway. Found a cabin about 3 hours out. Middle of nowhere, no idea whose it was at the time. He shook his head slowly. Turned out to be a Corvid maintenance shelter. Empty. Unlocked. Thank God. Because I don't think I had the strength left to break in if it hadn't been. I got the wood stove going, packed the wound as best I could with what was in their first aid kit, and radioed a distress signal on their own equipment, which is either the funniest or the most humiliating part of this whole story, depending on the day you catch me on. They found you there. Vasquez's team on the second sweep. About 6 hours after they pulled you out. He managed a tired half smile. I keep telling myself I'd have made it out on my own eventually. I don't actually believe that. I think that cabin saved my life, and I think the only reason I found it at all is because you taught me to read terrain the same way your grandmother taught you, bearing off a fixed point, just like you showed me on the flight in. Harlow felt her throat tighten, gratitude and grief tangled too closely together to separate cleanly, and the facility, locked down. Command's got people crawling all over it now that there's an actual SEAL incident report attached instead of a request somebody could keep quietly burying. He paused. Vasquez wants to talk to you. Soon as you're able. Vasquez. Chief who found you. Pulled you out of that overhang himself. Bridger's voice softened in a way that made Harlow's chest tighten before he even finished the sentence. Harlow. He knew your grandmother's name before he ever saw yours on a medical tag. Not the mission, her. Personally, Harlow closed her eyes. Because of course he had. Because nothing about this mountain, nothing about this entire nightmare, had ever been as contained as Desmond Cray's original phone call made it sound. A missing survey team. A simple extraction. A one-time favor for people who used to work with her grandmother's old handlers. Except it had never been simple. Except every layer she peeled back only revealed another one underneath. Older, deeper, more carefully buried than the last, which meant this wasn't over, not even close. I need to see him, she said. Vasquez, you need to rest. I need to see him, Bridger. He studied her for a long moment, the particular look he'd given her 100 times before, across 100 smaller decisions, weighing whether to push back or step aside. He stepped aside. He always did in the end when it mattered. I'll get the nurse, he said. Chief Vasquez arrived an hour later, still in uniform, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept properly since the extraction. He stood at the foot of her bed for a moment before he spoke, studying her face with an intensity that made Harlow acutely aware of how closely she must resemble a woman he'd apparently only ever heard about in stories. Ms. Reyes. He nodded once. Glad you're still with us. Chief Vasquez. Thank you. For finding me. Wasn't luck. He pulled the visitor's chair closer, sat, folded his hands. Your SOS beacon put out a signal precise enough that we had you within 200 yards before we ever set boots on that ridge. Whoever taught you to carry backup gear like that knew exactly what they were doing. She did. Eleanor Ashworth. The name, spoken out loud by a stranger in a hospital room, landed differently than it had landed in her own head for years. Heavier. More real. You knew her, Harlow said. Not quite a question. I knew of her. My old team leader served alongside people who trained under programs she'd walked away from, decades before my time. He talked about her like she was half myth, the best shot most of that generation ever saw, and the only one smart enough, or stubborn enough, to walk away from a program that chewed up everyone else who came near it. Vasquez's mouth pressed into a hard line. I didn't know until 3 days ago that the program she walked away from still existed, still operating, under a different name, a private contractor's letterhead, and apparently a great deal of protection from somewhere well above my pay grade. You said protection. I said a great deal of it. He met her eyes directly. Commands tried to get eyes on that facility for 8 months. Every request got buried before it cleared review. That doesn't happen by accident, Ms. Reyes. That happens because somebody with real authority wants it buried. Harlow felt something cold settle into her chest, a colder cousin of the fear she'd felt on the mountain, quieter but somehow worse. Who? That's what we intend to find out. Vasquez leaned forward. But I'll be honest with you. This isn't a fight the Navy can finish alone. Whatever's protecting Corvette dynamics from oversight is sitting somewhere in the civilian chain, or high enough in the Pentagon that a military investigation alone won't crack it open. We're going to need documentation. Paper trail. Something that can't be quietly disappeared the way every request for a look inside that facility has been disappeared for the better part of a year. My grandmother's notebook might be a start, might not be enough on its own. He hesitated, and something in the hesitation told Harlow there was more coming. Something he'd clearly debated whether to raise at all. There's someone else you should probably talk to before we go any further. Someone who called this hospital's front desk 4 times in the last 2 days, asking for updates on your condition. Hospital wouldn't release information, not without your consent, but she left a number. Who? A Marguerite Reyes. The name hit harder than the bullet had. Harlow lay very still, the heart monitor beside her betraying, in a small and humiliating spike of beeping, exactly how much that name still cost her. My mother, she said quietly, I gathered. Vasquez's voice gentled, just slightly, the practiced gentleness of a man who'd delivered hard news to enough families to know how to make room for whatever came next. I'll leave that decision to you. But for what it's worth, Miss Reyes, 4 calls in 2 days isn't the behavior of someone who doesn't care. He left the number on the bedside table before he stood to go, pausing once more at the door. For what it's worth, Vasquez added, Senior Chief Bannerman asked me to pass something along. He said to tell you his own mentor spoke of your grandmother like she was something close to legend, long before either of us ever wore this uniform. He said finding you alive on that mountain felt less like an extraction and more like closing a debt the Navy's owed her memory for a very long time. I don't disagree with him. Harlow didn't trust her voice enough to answer that properly, so she only nodded, and Vasquez let himself out, leaving the number sitting there in blue ballpoint, ordinary and enormous all at once. She didn't call. Not that day. She called the next morning, before she'd fully decided to, her thumb moving across the screen with a kind of muscle memory that outran her actual willingness, and the phone rang twice before a voice picked up, breathless, like it had been waiting close by the entire time. Harlow? Just her name. Nothing else. And somehow that was worse, more disarming than anything elaborate could have been. Mom. The word came out smaller than she intended. A long silence on the other end. Harlow could hear her mother breathing, could hear the particular catch in it that meant she was fighting not to cry, or fighting not to say too much too fast, or both. I heard what happened, Marguerite finally said. I heard, and I need to see you, please. I know we haven't. I know it's been 3 years, but please let me come. Harlow closed her eyes. 3 years since the fight neither of them had ever properly named, let alone resolved. 3 years of birthday texts that got shorter and shorter until they stopped altogether. 3 years of a silence that had felt, at the time, like the only available option, and felt now, lying in a hospital bed with a bullet wound healing beneath thick gauze, like the single stupidest decision of Harlow's entire life. Come, Harlow said, please come. Marguerite arrived 4 hours later, having driven through weather that should have kept any sane person off the road, and when she walked into the hospital room, she stopped just inside the doorway, hand pressed briefly to her mouth, taking in the sight of her daughter propped against pillows with an IV line and a shoulder wrapped thick with bandages. Oh, Marguerite said, just that. Oh. as though the sight had knocked every other word clean out of her. "Hi, Mom." Marguerite crossed the room fast, sat carefully on the edge of the bed, took Harlow's uninjured hand in both of hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence held, but it wasn't the old silence, the brittle, 3-year silence that had sat between them like a locked door. This silence had something underneath it, something trying to get out. "I need to tell you something," Marguerite said finally. "I've needed to tell you for 26 years, and I kept telling myself there'd be a better time. There was never going to be a better time. I understand that now. Mom, let me say it, please, before I lose my nerve again." Harlow nodded, throat tight, and waited. "When you were a baby," Marguerite began, her voice unsteady, "a man came to see me. Silas Marrow. He said he was an old associate of my mother's. He said he needed to discuss a matter of ongoing national importance." Her mouth twisted bitterly around the phrase, like it tasted wrong even now. What he actually meant was that my mother had cost his organization decades of research by refusing a program in 9978, and that the data she'd refused to provide had become, in his words, unfinished business. He wanted access to her notes, her medical history, anything that might help them complete what she'd walked away from. "You never told me any of this, because I said no." Marguerite's grip on Harlow's hand tightened, the same way she said no, and he made it very clear, very calmly, exactly what saying no might eventually cost. "Not me. You. A 6-month-old baby who couldn't possibly understand what kind of world she'd been born into." She drew a shaking breath. "I signed something, an agreement. I gave them nothing, but I agreed to stay silent about the conversation, in exchange for them agreeing to stay away from you, from us. As long as I kept quiet." Harlow felt the pieces shifting inside her chest, a whole architecture of old resentment rearranging itself around a shape she'd never once considered. "That's why you pulled away from me," she said slowly, growing up. "That's why you always seemed so careful, distant. I thought distance would keep you safer." Marguerite's eyes filled, finally, the tears she'd clearly been holding back since she walked through the door. "I thought if I loved you too visibly, too closely, someone might notice exactly how much you mattered to me, and use that. I know now how wrong that was. I know I traded away 26 years of being close to my own daughter for a kind of protection that turned out to be worth exactly nothing, because here you are anyway, shot, nearly frozen to death, on the same mountain chasing the same secret, exactly the thing I spent my whole adult life trying to keep you away from. Mom, that wasn't your fault. I've been watching them for years, Harlow." Marguerite pulled a folded envelope from her coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from handling. Quietly, carefully, every filing Corvid Dynamics made, every subsidiary, every government contract I could find public record of. I never had proof of anything specific enough to act on. But I built a file, in case you ever needed it, in case this exact day ever came, and some part of me always believed it would. She handed the envelope over, and Harlow opened it with fingers that weren't entirely steady, and found inside a meticulous, handwritten timeline spanning decades, dates and names and contract numbers, the quiet, patient work of a woman who'd spent half her life keeping watch from a distance she'd convinced herself was the only safe one. "You did this alone," Harlow said softly. "For years. I did it because I couldn't do anything else. Because saying no once, the way my mother said no, wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning of a much longer, much quieter one." Marguerite reached out, brushed a strand of hair back from Harlow's forehead, a gesture so achingly maternal that Harlow felt her own eyes sting. "I'm done being quiet now. Whatever you need, whatever this takes. I'm not watching from a distance anymore." Harlow reached for her mother's hand and held it, tightly, the way she hadn't allowed herself to hold it in 3 long years, and a knot that had sat clenched behind her ribs for far longer than that, finally, slowly, began to loosen. "I love you," Harlow said. "I don't think I ever stopped being angry long enough to say that properly. But I love you, I always did. I know." Marguerite's voice broke completely on the words. "I love you too. More than I ever let myself show you. That's going to change. Starting now." They stayed like that for a long time, mother and daughter, hands clasped in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, while outside the window the Alaska sky finally began clearing after days of unbroken storm. Later, after the nurse had come and gone twice, checking vitals and gently suggesting Marguerite let her daughter rest. Marguerite lingered anyway in the chair beside the bed, unwilling, it seemed, to let even a few unnecessary feet of distance open back up between them so soon after closing 3 years of it. "Tell me about her," Harlow said quietly, drowsy now with the pull of pain medication and exhaustion both. "Not the parts I already know. The parts that were just yours. Before all of this." Marguerite's face softened into something Harlow hadn't seen there in years, an old, unguarded tenderness. She used to sing while she cleaned her rifles. Off-key, terribly off-key, hymns mostly, and she'd stop the second she noticed anyone listening, like she'd been caught doing something embarrassing instead of something lovely. She laughed softly. "I used to hide in the hallway just to hear it. I never told her that. I wish I had." "Tell me more," Harlow murmured, eyes already drifting closed. "Tell me everything you never told me." "I will," Marguerite promised, smoothing the blanket over her daughter's shoulder as Harlow finally slid into sleep. "I have so much time now to tell you everything." Harlow was discharged 6 days later, her shoulder still stiff and heavily wrapped, her strength returning slowly but steadily under the combined stubbornness of a body her grandmother had built to endure, and a will that had never once, in 27 years, learned how to quit halfway through anything that mattered. She found Bridger and Marisol waiting in the hospital lobby, both of them upright now, both of them wearing the particular restless energy of people who'd spent too many days confined to beds and hallways and were more than ready to move again. "You look terrible," Marisol said by way of greeting, her wrist in a bright blue cast, her grin fierce and entirely unbothered by frostbite scarring along one cheek. "You look worse, Fair." Marisol's grin widened. "Vasquez briefed us. Whole teams assembling this afternoon. Command's finally cleared a joint operation, Navy oversight plus federal investigators, to go back into that facility properly. Full documentation. Full chain of custody on whatever we find." She paused, softer now. "You don't have to be part of it, Harlow. Nobody would think less of you for sitting this one out. I'm part of it." Harlow's voice left no room for argument. "This started with my grandmother refusing to let them win. It's not ending with me sitting in a waiting room while other people finish it for her." Marguerite, standing a step behind, said nothing, but the look on her face carried its own quiet answer. Pride, fear, and, underneath both, an unmistakable resolve that mirrored her daughter's exactly. "Then let's finish it," Marguerite said. The facility looked different in daylight, under armed federal escort, than it had in the panicked chaos of the ambush 9 days earlier. Smaller, somehow, less monstrous. Just a cluster of gray buildings squatting on a windswept ridge, stripped now of the menace that darkness and gunfire had lent it, revealed instead as something almost mundane. Bureaucratic, the banality of an evil that had never needed to announce itself with anything more dramatic than a research charger and a very good lawyer. They moved through the main entrance in a column, Vasquez and Bannerman flanking Harlow, federal investigators trailing behind with evidence cases and cameras. Bridger limping but insistent, Marisol scanning every hallway with the sharp, restless attention of someone who fully intended never to be caught unprepared inside these walls again. Before they reached the server room, they passed through a chamber that stopped the entire column cold. A wide windowless space, walls lined with insulated panels, a bank of environmental controls capable, according to the technician who studied them, of driving the room's temperature down past anything survivable within minutes. Restraint points bolted into a steel gurney at the room's center. Medical monitoring equipment, decades old in places, newer in others, layered generation over generation like geological strata, evidence of a program that had simply kept operating, quietly upgrading itself, while the world outside forgot it had ever existed. Harlow stood in the doorway and did not go in. She didn't need to. She understood, standing there, exactly what this room was, exactly what it had been built to do to a body, and exactly why her grandmother had spent 40 years refusing to let her own body become its measurement. Marisol came up beside her, uncharacteristically quiet, and put a hand briefly on Harlow's good shoulder. "This is where she said no," Marisol said softly. "Isn't it? This or somewhere just like it." Harlow's voice came out steadier than she felt. 40 years ago. Same walls. Same restraints probably, just replaced a few times since. She made herself breathe. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. I keep thinking about how young she was. 32. younger than I am now, standing somewhere very close to exactly where we're standing, deciding whether her whole future was worth more than whatever they were offering her to give it up. She decided it was. She decided it was. Harlow turned away from the doorway, toward the corridor leading deeper into the facility, toward whatever answers still waited beyond it. I intend to make sure that decision finally counts for something. They found the server room on the second sublevel, behind a door that took federal technicians 40 minutes to breach properly, and inside it, rack after rack of storage drives that would take investigators weeks to fully process. They found something else too, something Harlow hadn't expected, and would spend years afterward turning over in her mind. They found Silas Marrow. He was sitting, alone, in a small office near the server room, no weapon in reach, no security detail remaining, an old man in a gray cardigan who looked, in that moment, considerably smaller than the shadow he'd cast across 4 decades of Ashworth family history. He looked up when they entered. Didn't stand. Didn't reach for anything. "I wondered if you'd come yourself," he said, looking directly at Harlow. "I confess I hoped you would. It seemed only right, given everything. Given everything you did to my grandmother. Given everything I tried to protect this country from having to learn the hard way." His voice carried no anger, no defensiveness, only a strange, exhausted certainty. The voice of a man who had spent so long justifying himself to himself that the justification had long since calcified into something he genuinely believed. "You think I'm a monster, I understand why. But I've spent 40 years watching the world grow colder, more dangerous, more unpredictable, and I made a choice, a long time ago, to be one of the people willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of making sure this country's soldiers survive conditions that would otherwise kill them. Your grandmother had a gift for that work, a rare one. I never stopped believing that gift belonged to something larger than her own comfort. Her comfort." Harlow's voice shook with a fury she hadn't fully allowed herself until this exact moment. "You mean her body, her suffering. You wanted to use her like a piece of equipment. I wanted her contribution. There's a difference, even if I understand why it never looked like one from where she was standing." For the first time, something flickered across his face that might have been regret, quickly suppressed. "I was young when I first met her. I believed, genuinely believed, that the ends justified whatever discomfort the means required. I still believe the ends matter. I've simply had 40 years to learn that belief alone doesn't excuse everything done in its name." Harlow stared at him, and for one strange, unwelcome moment, she felt something that wasn't quite sympathy, but stood uncomfortably close to it. A man who had built an entire life around a conviction, watched it curdle slowly over decades into something monstrous, and never once found the courage or the humility to stop and ask whether the conviction itself had been wrong from the very beginning. "You bribed a member of my rescue team," she said instead, forcing her voice steady. "You had 6 contractors disappeared. You shot me. You held my friend prisoner in that cell downstairs. Whatever you tell yourself about your intentions, that's what actually happened. Those are the facts, and facts don't care how carefully you've justified them to yourself." "No," he said quietly. "I suppose they don't." For a moment, nobody in the room spoke. Bannerman shifted near the doorway, hand still resting near his sidearm, and Bridger leaned heavily against the frame, favoring his healing leg, watching the exchange with the wary stillness of a man who had learned, a long time ago, never to trust a confession that arrived this easily. "You said you hoped I'd come myself," Harlow said. "Why?" Marrow considered the question longer than seemed necessary, his eyes moving briefly to the window, to the ridge beyond it, white and indifferent under a pale sky. "Because I wanted to see, finally, what 40 years of patience actually produced," he said. "Your grandmother refused me once, in a room not unlike this one, and I spent the rest of my career telling myself she'd simply lacked the vision to understand what we were building. I told myself that story so many times I nearly believed it completely." He looked back at Harlow, and then I watched a 27-year-old woman survive -71 degrees on a mountain that has killed trained soldiers in a fraction of that time, using nothing but what her grandmother taught her by hand, one lesson at a time, across a childhood I once dismissed as an old woman's stubborn refusal to let go of a grudge. I find I no longer know which one of us actually understood what mattered. "Who else knew?" she pressed. Who's been protecting this facility? Commands tried for 8 months to get eyes on this place, and every request disappeared. That doesn't happen without help from somewhere much higher than a private contractor's chairman. Something shifted behind Marrow's eyes, calculation replacing the strange, weary honesty of a moment before. That information, he said carefully, is worth considerably more to me than anything I've said so far. You're not exactly in a position to negotiate. Everyone's always in a position to negotiate, Ms. Reyes. Your grandmother taught you to shoot. She should have also taught you that. A ghost of something almost like admiration crossed his face. But I'll tell you anyway. Not for leverage. Because I'm tired, and because some part of me has been waiting a long time to stop carrying this particular weight alone. He reached slowly into a desk drawer, and Vasquez's hand moved instantly to his sidearm. But Marrow only withdrew a small drive, black and unremarkable, and set it on the desk between them. Deputy Assistant Secretary Holloway Prescott, he said. Defense Oversight Division. He's approved this facility's classification exemptions for the last 11 years, in exchange for a share in Corvide's federal contracting revenue, funneled through channels sophisticated enough that no routine audit would ever surface them. Everything you need is on that drive. Every payment, every classification waiver he signed personally, every request from the Navy that mysteriously never made it past his desk. The room went very still. Why, Harlow asked, would you give this to me? Marrow considered the question for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried something that sounded, disturbingly, like relief. Because I am 70 years old, and I have spent 40 of those years protecting a man who was never protecting anything but his own bank account. Because whatever I believed about the value of this program, Prescott believed in nothing except what it could put in his pocket. And because, he added, meeting Harlow's eyes directly, your grandmother was the only person who ever told me no, and meant it completely enough to make me doubt myself, even for a moment. I've spent 4 decades trying to prove her wrong. I find now, at the end of it, that some part of me would rather she'd been right all along. Federal agents took him into custody 20 minutes later, and Harlow watched him go without any of the satisfaction she'd imagined she might feel. Watched an old man led out through a doorway he'd controlled for decades, and felt, instead, a hollow, complicated exhaustion that had no clean name. The drive changed everything. Over the following 6 weeks, federal investigators cross-referenced every payment, every waiver, every buried request against Deputy Assistant Secretary Prescott's own financial records, building a case methodical enough that even his own legal team, when the arrest finally came, offered no serious argument against the evidence laid in front of them. The story broke nationally within days. Corvide Dynamics dissolved under federal receivership, its remaining contracts terminated, its facility on the Ridge sealed permanently under Navy custody, pending a full congressional review. Harlow testified twice, once before a closed Inspector General panel and once, months later, before a Congressional Oversight Committee convened specifically to examine decades of unreported cold weather testing programs across multiple private contractors. She sat in a wood-paneled hearing room in Washington, her shoulder fully healed by then, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, and she told them everything. Her grandmother's notebook, the 1978 refusal, the ambush on the Ridge, the 4 layers of patient, calculated waiting that had nearly cost her own life. A congresswoman from Alaska, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward at the end of Harlow's testimony and asked a question that wasn't strictly part of the official proceedings. Ms. Reyes, your grandmother refused this program in 1978 at considerable personal cost and told no one the full truth for the rest of her life. What do you think she'd say if she could see you sitting here today, finishing what she started? Harlow considered the question for a long moment, thinking of gray winter light through a kitchen window, of steady hands braiding hair, of a rifle passed down like an inheritance nobody ever explained the full weight of until it was far too late to hand it back. I think she'd say she was tired of being the only one who said no, Harlow finally answered. I think she'd be glad it isn't just her fighting alone anymore. A second committee member, an older congressman from Ohio, who had listened through most of the hearing with his glasses, pushed up on his forehead, and an expression of carefully banked outrage cleared his throat before the chairwoman could move to close the session. "One more question, if I may," he said. "You could have stayed hidden. Your grandmother built you an entire life designed around never having to stand in a room like this one. Why didn't you take it?" Harlow met his eyes steadily. "Because hiding is what let this program survive 40 years in the first place. Every person who ever said no and then stayed quiet about it bought Silas Marrow another decade to keep going. I understood that the moment I read my grandmother's notebook all the way through, really understood it, not just as a fact but as something I was responsible for. Silence protects the people doing the harming. It doesn't protect anyone else." She paused. "My grandmother protected me the only way she knew how. I'm trying to protect the next person the only way I know how. I don't think those are actually different things." The congressman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. "Thank you, Ms. Reyes. This committee is grateful for your courage in coming forward." The hearing room fell quiet for a moment, and then the chairwoman thanked her, and it was, finally, officially over. Deputy Assistant Secretary Prescott was indicted on federal corruption charges 8 months after Harlow's testimony, convicted 11 months after that, his career and his freedom, both ending in a courtroom far removed from the mountain where his decisions had nearly ended a young woman's life. Silas Marrow, in failing health and facing charges that would likely outlast whatever years he had left, cooperated fully with prosecutors, a decision his lawyers framed as contrition and Harlow privately understood as something closer to exhaustion. A man finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. Desmond Cray took a plea agreement, testified against both men, and disappeared into a federal witness program under a name Harlow would never learn, and, she found, no longer particularly wanted to know. Spring came late to Alaska that year, the way it always did. Snow lingering stubborn in shadowed hollows well into what calendars insisted was already May. Harlow drove north on a morning bright enough to hurt her eyes, her mother in the passenger seat beside her, a small wooden box resting on Marguerite's lap that neither of them had spoken about yet, though both understood exactly what waited inside it. They parked at the base of a ridge Harlow now knew better than almost any place on earth, hiked 40 minutes up a trail her grandmother had once walked, as a young woman, with a rifle over her shoulder and a refusal already forming somewhere deep in her chest, and stopped, finally, at an overlook where the whole valley spread out below them, pine and granite, and, far in the distance, the sealed gray outline of a facility that would never operate again. Neither of them spoke much on the climb. The silence between them now was a different animal entirely from the silence that had once stretched across 3 unspoken years. Easy where the old one had been jagged, companionable where the old one had cut. Marguerite paused twice to catch her breath, laughing softly at herself both times, and Harlow slowed her own pace without being asked, matching her mother's rhythm, the way she'd once matched her grandmother's, some part of her recognizing that this, too, was a kind of inheritance worth protecting. "She used to say this climb built character," Marguerite said at the second pause, wiping melting snow from her glove. "I used to think that was just something adults said to make children stop complaining." Was she right? She was always right. That was the maddening part. Marguerite smiled a little sadly. "I spent so many years angry at her for things I didn't understand yet. I don't want to spend the years I have left with you making that same mistake twice." Harlow reached over and squeezed her mother's hand, and they climbed the rest of the way in a silence that needed no further words to carry its weight. Marguerite opened the box. Inside it, wrapped in tissue paper gone soft with age, sat Eleanor Ashworth's notebook, its spine cracked, its pages full of decades of careful, furious handwriting that had finally, after everything, done exactly what its author intended. It had told the truth. Just late enough, and just loud enough to matter. "She used to bring me up here," Marguerite said quietly, looking out over the valley, "when I was small. Before I understood any of what she carried. She'd just stand right here and look north for the longest time, not saying anything. And I always thought she was looking at the mountains." "She wasn't looking at the mountains," Harlow said softly. "No," Marguerite's eyes filled. "I understand that now." They buried the notebook together at the base of a lone spruce marking the overlook, not because Eleanor's words needed hiding any longer, the truth having already traveled far beyond anything a single notebook could contain. But because some things belonged to the earth once their work was finally, completely done. A quiet, private ritual for a woman who had spent her whole life being anything but quiet about what actually mattered. "I love you," Eleanor had never once said, not in Harlow's memory, not in words. She had said it, instead, in coordinates memorized before their meaning was understood, in wind readings taught patiently to a 9-year-old, in every careful, unspoken lesson designed to make sure her granddaughter would survive a world Eleanor herself had barely survived. Harlow understood, finally, standing on that ridge with her mother's hand in hers, that this had been the whole of her grandmother's love language. Preparation disguised as discipline. Protection disguised as distance. A refusal whispered across 2 more generations that had finally, at long last, been spoken loud enough for the whole world to hear. "Ready to head back?" Marguerite asked. Harlow looked north one more time, toward mountains that no longer held any secrets worth guarding, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could easily remember. Not peace exactly. Something steadier than peace, something closer to completion. "Ready," she said. They walked down together, mother and daughter, into a spring finally arriving on its own patient schedule, leaving behind a mountain that had tried, across 40 years and 2 generations, to erase a family that had simply, stubbornly, refused to disappear. 6 months later, Harlow stood again at the edge of a different tree line, teaching a new class of strangers how to read wind through branches instead of flags, her shoulder fully healed, her voice steady, her grandmother's rifle resting nearby against a fence post where it belonged. A young woman near the back raised her hand, curious, careful. "How'd you learn all this?" she asked. Harlow considered the question, thought of a woman with silver hair and steady hands, of a notebook now resting quietly beneath a spruce tree on a ridge that finally, after everything, kept no more secrets. "My grandmother taught me," she said simply. She was the best there ever was. It just took the rest of the world a very long time to find that out. Another student, older, arms crossed against the cold, spoke up before Harlow could turn back to the trees. "There's a story about you online. About the mountain. Is it true?" Harlow held the question a moment, weighing how much of it belonged to strangers, and how much still belonged only to her. "Most of it," she said finally. "The parts that matter anyway." She turned back to the class, raised her hand toward the trees, and began, patiently, the way Eleanor once had, to teach. That evening, after the last student's truck pulled out of the gravel lot and the light went the particular gray it always went this far north, Harlow stood alone at her kitchen window for a long moment, watching the color settle over the ridgeline in the distance. For 27 years, that exact gray had meant something unspoken and unexplained. A private grief belonging entirely to a grandmother who never once let anyone close enough to share its weight. Harlow understood it now fully, the way she understood wind and terrain and the long, careful architecture of a love that had never once needed to announce itself in words to be real. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her mother, 3 states away now but closer somehow than she'd been in over a decade. "Thinking of you tonight. Proud of you doesn't begin to cover it. Call me when you can. No rush. I'm not going anywhere." Harlow smiled, typed back a short reply, and set the phone down. Outside, the last of the daylight folded quietly into the mountains, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the gray held no grief in it at all, only quiet, earned finally the hard way. And somewhere beneath a lone spruce tree on a ridge that kept no more secrets, a notebook rested in the dark, its work, at long last, complete.